In 1970, about a third of the adult population were smokers. And when ACOSH got involved, there were a number of obstacles. One was that this was a socially accepted, if not necessarily welcomed, behaviour, and to get behavioural change over time is difficult. Secondly, a third of the population were already addicted, and they need persuasion to say that their addiction needed to be addressed and, if possible, to be helped them to quit. The community was awash with advertising. Wherever you looked, it was there. Massive billboards, as big as they could make them, in the print media, in the television media, in radio, in editorials, editorial after editorial, saying, how dare you try and do something about this matter. If it's legal to sell, it ought to be legal to advertise. 1976 was an important year because the federal legislation banning advertising in television and radio, but it didn't ban what the television cameras would pick up at sporting venues. So the tobacco industry, of course, used that to the hilt. The tobacco industry, of course, was incredibly wealthy, well-connected politically. It funded political parties. It wined and dined politicians, no doubt, and other policymakers.
I then decided we had to take it seriously. It was the largest preventable cause of death and disease in the state, and virtually nothing was being done about it. Nothing. Of course, once the tobacco industry found out that I was actually serious about it and was going to do something about it, their reaction was furious.
The anti-smoking entrepreneurs in the Department of Health have exceeded their boundaries in terms of conducting an education campaign in health. I think that what they're doing is conducting a campaign against the tobacco industry.
I don't think they could believe it. They had a pretty set approach to tackling any politicians who dared to try and take action against them. And that would be that they would launch a furious media campaign against the government and against the minister.
The AMA generally, whether Australia or Western Australia, has been heavily involved, and there's been many champion presidents of the AMA, that the only way we were going to beat tobacco was legislatively. We didn't have the money that Big Tobacco had to pour into advertising campaigns. So we actually had to come up with something, and legislation was the way to do it. Late 80s, the AMA actually had a campaign called Smoking Death Card Report. Now, this was a strong message. We needed to make members of Parliament realise just how important this was and how many people were actually dying of the ill effects of smoking cigarettes.
This is particularly sad when you look at the health consequences for women, because over and above the health consequences for men, we do have the risks of oral contraception with smoking. We have new evidence on cervical cancer and a link with smoking.
This is about the virus. Sorry, about the viral hypothesis.
We have the other evidence on lower birth weight babies.
We're on equal ground. There is some sharing of views
I'm sorry, I can't believe that you would be supporting any health cause here when you stand up and publicly deny the evidence.
It not only killed through lung cancer, but it led to your legs being amputated, your feet being amputated, your voice boxes being removed. And we did some pretty creative things. We brought along about 30 jars full of blackened lungs and gangrenous feet and larynxes with cancer. And we staged this in front of, at the AMA, in front of an absolutely brimful media room. And of course, this became not just Australian news again, but this became international news, that this is the damage that smoking does. So we had to be clever, doing things that were strategic, very cheap, or in this case, hardly any cost at all. But we had to forge our partnerships carefully, because having credible people to show up the lack of credibility in the tobacco industry was one of our key goals. Certainly one of the other driving forces behind a new approach to public education campaigns on tobacco was a need for a much stronger, harder hitting advocacy element. And certainly that's probably one aspect of Make Smoking history in which the campaign has truly excelled. One of the early campaigns with John Clark, where he played a tobacco company executive, and essentially he spoke truth. So essentially he talked about how tobacco company executives perceive their product. That certainly garnered a huge amount of public and media attention.
Hello. As you may know, cigarettes have been linked to cancer, addiction, emphysema, heart disease and premature death. And as a result, we at My Tobacco Company are introducing a total product recall. All of our product will be withdrawn from sale wherever it is in Australia until we can guarantee that it poses absolutely no threat to your health.
Some of the most powerful television campaigns and the most impactful have probably been the ones that have featured real people. There's certainly a number of campaigns that Make Smoking history has produced over the years where individuals with life-threatening illnesses have been willing to share their stories. And we certainly know from the evaluation of those campaigns where they have featured people telling their personal stories, has had a big effect in terms of people looking to quit and stop smoking altogether.
It hurts, to think that I won't be there. I look at them and I think, oh my God, who's going to kiss them goodnight? Who's going to do those little things that only I can do? And it sounds really cliche and everything, but when you're going through this, that's what you think of.
TIS stands for the Tackling Indigenous Smoking team or program. And I think we have seen the shift in terms of when the programs first came on board in the early days. We had people smoking in households. We had the uptake of, smoking at least 20 odd smokes, cigarettes a day, knowing that that's nicotine independency. And we have seen that shift over the years that people, and especially the younger kids will tell you, oh, mum and dad's not smoking in their house now, or they're smoking outside, or they've quit completely. So just hearing those stories is a positive that we are moving in the right direction and we have made an impact within the community.
With the introduction of the hard-hitting media campaigns that graphically portrayed the health effects of smoking, it legitimised policy and legislative change to mark out non-smoking areas. A big part of that was restricting where people could smoke, for example, public transport, aircraft, at work, in restaurants, in bars. They were the very strong signals to people that smoking was becoming very socially unacceptable and denormalised. Restrictions on smoking in public places had two important collateral effects. One was to reduce the number of cigarettes smoked during the day because smokers didn't make them up at night. And secondly, they prompted quit attempts. Well, denormalising smoking, along with tax increases and strong media campaigns, has been one of the most successful strategies for reducing smoking.
Well, the evidence on the dangers of smoking is absolutely rock solid. The Tobacco Institute doesn't believe that smoking does any damage. Well, what you have to take on the one hand is the Tobacco Institute. On the other hand, you have reports from the World Health Organization, the Rock.
From very early on, there was some pressure for warnings on cigarette packs, but the early warnings were just insipid, and they were designed pretty much to be ineffective.
A survey we had done in the last few weeks shows that over 81% of the population here vastly underestimate the size of the smoking problem.
But they got stronger and stronger, and then, of course, about 10 years ago, we got tobacco plain packaging, which is really the model, because what that does is it reduces and pretty much gets away with the glamour of cigarette packaging. It gives you packs that are designed to be as unattractive as possible to kids, and it gives you strong evidence-based health warnings with cut-through. So it's taken 50 years, but we've got there on plain packaging. And what's really exciting is it shows that you can achieve the impossible. I think that along with plain packaging, a milestone was in 2011 when the then government agreed to have regular, substantial tax increases. There's been evidence for so long. I mean, it's logical. The more expensive the product is, the less people are going to use it, and the less attractive the product's going to be to kids. So what we have to do is just make sure that that price keeps increasing, and every time you see a price increase, you see a reduction in smoking.
Perth, Western Australia. Population now more than 1 million, and around 330,000 of them cigarette smokers. But when it comes to the war over whether to puff or not to puff, it's this figure that's causing all the problems.
You know, one of the bizarre things about cigarettes is that here you have a lethal and addictive product that's incredibly widely available and accessible. And I think what we should be seeing is a gradual reduction in the number of sales outlets where you can get cigarettes.
Opposition, the health department says, doesn't have a legal leg to stand on.
Well, I don't think they'll like it, but they're going to have to live with it.
Always remember, our largest preventable cause of death and disease, and the only reason that we haven't got rid of it is that there's a large and powerful industry that's absolutely determined to keep selling as many of their products as they can, even despite the evidence.
With all we know about tobacco, what we know about nicotine, and what we know about addiction, this is something that should never have been around for as long as it has. And seeing it come to an end will be a huge step forward for the health of our community.
We can really clearly see the success of tobacco control by looking at the proportion of people who are smokers. When we look back to the start of the 1980s, 35% of the Australian population of adults were smokers, and that came down to 28% by the end of that decade. In 2001, there were 22% of people smoking, and by 2019, that had come down to 13%. In the 2021 National Health Survey, we have a prevalence of 10.7%, which provides even more encouragement.
And so what's really encouraging for the future is the trend we see in teenagers. Back in 1984, only 30% said they'd never smoked, while now we know that 83% of teenagers have never smoked. But we can look forward to a future where that's 100% who've never smoked.
If we strengthen our efforts to regulate tobacco, if governments across Australia invest in campaigns to minimise the commencement of smoking amongst young people and support its cessation, then there will be hundreds of thousands of lives saved in Australia this century.